The sound of her father's drunken laughter rising from the saloon below made Grace Jennings freeze with one leg already out her bedroom window, the pre-dawn air cold against her skin as she balanced precariously on the narrow ledge. She had packed only what she could carry in a small leather satchel, her mother's silver locket, a single change of clothes, the $43 she had saved coin by coin over 2 years, and a canteen of water that might keep her alive long enough to reach somewhere, anywhere, that was not here. Below her window, the dusty streets of Placitas, New Mexico, lay silent in that suspended moment before sunrise when the world held its breath, and Grace held hers too, as she lowered herself down the trellis that had never been meant to bear the weight of a fleeing bride. The wooden slats creaked under her boots, and she pressed herself flat against the adobe wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might wake the entire territory. It was March of 1878, and in approximately 4 hours, she was supposed to walk down the aisle of the small church at the edge of town to marry Bernard Whitmore, a cattle baron twice her age, with hands that had grabbed her waist too roughly and breath that smelled of cigars and entitlement. Her father had arranged it all, trading his only daughter for the cancellation of gambling debts and a percentage of Whitmore's ranch profits. And when Grace had protested, when she had begged on her knees for him to reconsider, he had struck her hard enough to leave a bruise that she had covered with powder for 3 days. She dropped the last few feet to the ground, landing in a crouch behind the rain barrel, and waited. No shouts came, no doors flew open. The town remained suspended in its pre-dawn sleep, and Grace seized the moment like a lifeline. She ran. Her feet carried her past the general store, past the blacksmith shop where the forge sat cold and dark, past the livery stable where horses shifted and snorted in their stalls. She knew where she was going, even if she did not know where she would end up. The stagecoach station at the edge of town represented her only chance at real escape, but it would not open for hours yet, and she could not risk being seen. Instead, she veered off the main road and headed for the rocky hills that rose like sleeping giants on the northern edge of Placitas, her breath coming in gasps that tore at her throat. The terrain grew rougher as she climbed, loose stones sliding beneath her boots, mesquite bushes catching at her skirts. She had worn her plainest dress, a faded blue calico that would not draw attention, and had braided her dark blonde hair in a single plait down her back. In the growing light, she could see the vast expanse of New Mexico territory spreading out below her, all red rock and endless sky, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She was 20 years old, alone, and running from the only life she had ever known, and the weight of that reality hit her so hard she had to stop and press her hand against a boulder to steady herself. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Her mother, who had died when Grace was 14, had once told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Grace had not understood then, but she understood now, as she forced her trembling legs to carry her higher into the hills, away from Placitas, away from Bernard Whitmore's possessive smile and her father's betrayal. The sun broke over the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold, and Grace knew she had perhaps an hour before someone discovered her empty room. She pushed herself harder, scrambling up an incline that left her gasping, her hands scraped raw from catching herself on rocks. At the top of the ridge, she paused to look back and saw the town laid out like a child's toy set, small and distant and already feeling like a place from another lifetime. That was when she heard the horse. The sound of hooves on stone carried clearly in the morning air, and Grace's blood turned to ice. They could not have found her already. It was impossible. She spun around, looking for cover, and spotted a cluster of larger boulders about 50 yards ahead. She ran for them, her satchel bouncing against her hip, her breath burning in her lungs. She threw herself behind the largest boulder and pressed her back against the sun-warmed stone, trying to make herself as small as possible. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. Grace squeezed her eyes shut and prayed to a god she was not sure was listening. "You can come on out," a man's voice called, deep and calm, and threaded with something that might have been amusement. "I am not going to hurt you." Grace did not move. It could be a trick. It probably was a trick. "I saw you running up here like the devil himself was chasing you," the voice continued. "And judging by the way you keep looking back at town, I would wager you are running from something down there, not running to something up here. That means you need help, not trouble. And I happen to be in the business of providing the former, not the latter." Something about his voice made Grace's racing heart slow, just a fraction. She peered around the edge of the boulder and saw him sitting astride a paint horse about 20 yards away. He was lean and tall even sitting down, wearing a dusty brown coat over a chambray shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen serious wear. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw and the way he sat easy in the saddle, like he and the horse were one entity. A coil of rope hung from his saddle, and she caught the glint of a pistol at his hip. "Who are you?" Grace called out, her voice shakier than she wanted it to be. "Name is Ethan Mallory," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed oddly courteous given the circumstances. "I work cattle for the Riverside outfit about 10 miles northwest of here. I was heading into Placitas for supplies when I saw you climbing up here like your life depended on it. Does it?" Grace opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I do not know you." "No, madam, you do not," Ethan agreed. "But that works both ways. I do not know you either, which means I have got no reason to lie to you and no stake in whatever trouble you are running from. I am just a cowboy trying to do a decent thing on a Tuesday morning. Now, are you going to come out and talk to me proper, or are we going to have this whole conversation with you hiding behind that rock?" Despite everything, despite the fear and the exhaustion and the fact that her entire world had just imploded, Grace felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. She swallowed it down and stepped out from behind the boulder, keeping her distance, her hand clutching her satchel like a shield. In the full light of morning, she could see him more clearly. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it brushed his collar. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-green, like water in a deep pool, and they studied her with an intensity that should have been unsettling, but somehow was not. There was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and his hands on the reins were broad and capable. "What is your name?" he asked. Grace hesitated. Giving him her name felt dangerous, but so did lying. "Grace Jennings?" Recognition flickered across his face. "The name Jennings rings a bell. Your father runs the saloon in town, does he not?" "He does," Grace said tightly. "And you were up here at dawn, running like hell, the morning of—" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Hold on. There was talk in town yesterday about a wedding. Jennings and Whitmore. That is today, is it not?" Grace said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Ethan's expression shifted, something hardening in those blue-green eyes. "Bernard Whitmore. That old bastard is at least 45 if he is a day, and I have heard stories about how he treats his help that would make your stomach turn. Your father actually sold you off to him?" "It is not your concern," Grace said, but her voice cracked on the last word. "Maybe not," Ethan said quietly. "But you are up here, which means you made a choice. That took courage." He paused, then added with something that sounded almost like admiration. "You made the bravest choice." Those words, simple and sincere, hit Grace like a physical force. Her eyes burned with sudden tears, and she blinked them back furiously. She had not cried when her father told her about the arrangement. She had not cried when Whitmore had cornered her in the mercantile and told her all the things he planned to do once she was his wife. She had not cried when she packed her bag in the darkness of her room. But this stranger's kindness, unexpected and unearned, threatened to shatter the careful control she had wrapped around herself like armor. "They will come looking for me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, Whitmore, maybe half the town. This is going to cause a scandal." "Let it," Ethan said flatly. "Scandal is better than a lifetime of misery." He shifted in his saddle, considering. "How far were you planning to get on foot?" "There is a stagecoach," Grace started, then stopped. The stagecoach station would be the first place they looked. She had been so focused on escaping that she had not thought beyond the immediate need to run. The realization of how ill-prepared she was hit her like cold water. "I have some money. I thought I could buy passage somewhere. Placitas only has one stage line, and it runs south to Albuquerque," Ethan said. "That coach does not leave until this afternoon, and I guarantee you that your father and Whitmore will have someone watching it by the time they realize you are gone. You need to get farther away, faster, and in a direction they would not expect." "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked suddenly. "You do not know me. This is not your problem." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon before returning to her face. My sister was 18 when my father tried to marry her off to a man who had already buried 2 wives under mysterious circumstances. She did not have the courage to run. She went through with it, thinking she had no choice. His jaw tightened. She died 6 months later. The official story was an accident with a horse, but I will never believe that. Grace felt her throat close up. I am sorry. Me too, Ethan said. Which is why, when I see a woman with enough fire in her to climb out a window and run for the hills, I am damned sure not going to be the person who sends her back to a life that will kill her spirit, if not her body. He held out his hand. Come on, I will take you to the Riverside Ranch. My boss, Sam Cordero, is a fair man, and his wife Ellen does not tolerate injustice. They will give you a place to stay while we figure out your next move. Grace stared at his outstretched hand. Accepting it meant trusting a complete stranger with her safety, maybe even her life. But staying here meant eventually being found, dragged back, forced into a marriage that made her skin crawl. She thought of her mother, of courage and forward motion, and she reached up and took his hand. His grip was strong and steady, and he pulled her up behind him on the horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. She settled behind him, acutely aware of the warmth of his back through her thin dress, the solid reality of him. She had never been this close to a man who was not family, and the intimacy of it made her flush. Hold on, Ethan said, and she wrapped her arms around his waist as he urged the horse forward. They rode north, away from Placitas, into the vast expanse of New Mexico territory. The landscape rolled out in shades of red and brown and dusty green, punctuated by juniper trees and the occasional mesa rising like a monument to time itself. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and Grace gradually felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Every mile they covered was a mile farther from the life she had been expected to live, a mile closer to something she could not yet name but desperately needed. How long have you been working cattle? She asked after a while, partly to break the silence and partly because she wanted to know more about this man, who had appeared at exactly the right moment. Since I was 14, Ethan said. Started as a ranch hand in Texas, worked my way up to trail boss by the time I was 21. Came to New Mexico territory 2 years ago looking for steadier work and found it with Riverside. It is hard work, but honest. Do you like it? I do, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. There is something about working with cattle and horses, being out under the sky all day. It makes sense in a way that people usually do not. A horse does not lie to you. Cattle do not pretend to be something they are not. What you see is what you get. That sounds peaceful, Grace said wistfully. It can be. It can also be dusty, exhausting, and occasionally terrifying when a steer decides it does not want to cooperate, Ethan said with a laugh. But yes, peaceful is a good word for it. What about you? What did you do before this morning? I helped run my father's saloon, Grace said, the words bitter in her mouth. Cooked, cleaned, served drinks, kept the books because my father cannot add 2 numbers together without getting it wrong. I basically ran the place while he drank away the profits and gambled away the rest. Sounds like you have skills, Ethan observed. Running a business is no small thing. I suppose, Grace said. I never thought about it that way. It was just what I had to do. Well, Ellen Cordero is always looking for help with managing the ranch accounts and supplies, Ethan said. She might appreciate having someone with experience. The idea that she might have value beyond being a bride bartered for debt repayment was so foreign that Grace did not know how to respond. She fell silent, watching the landscape change as they rode. The rocky hills gave way to more open country, dotted with cattle grazing in loose clusters. In the distance, she could see a line of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water, probably the river that gave Riverside Ranch its name. They reached the ranch just before midday. It was larger than Grace had expected, with a main house built of adobe and wood, several outbuildings, a large barn, and a network of corrals where horses milled about. A woman in a practical split skirt and a man's shirt was standing near one of the corrals, talking to a cowhand. She looked up as Ethan and Grace approached, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Ethan," she called out, walking toward them. "Who is this?" Ethan dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands careful on her waist. "Ellen, this is Grace Jennings. She needs help, and I told her we might be able to provide it." Ellen Cordero was in her late 30s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of direct gaze that saw straight through nonsense. She looked Grace up and down, taking in the dusty dress, the scraped hands, the exhaustion written in every line of her face. "Come inside," Ellen said without preamble. "You look like you could use some food and water, and then you can tell me what kind of trouble has you showing up at my ranch looking like you ran all the way here." Grace followed Ellen into the main house, leaving Ethan to tend to his horse. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight, furnished simply but comfortably. Ellen gestured for Grace to sit at a large wooden table and disappeared into what Grace assumed was the kitchen, returning moments later with a cup of water and a plate of bread and cheese. "Eat," Ellen commanded, and Grace obeyed, suddenly ravenous. She had not eaten anything since yesterday afternoon, too nervous about the impending wedding to stomach food. The bread was fresh and hearty, the cheese sharp and satisfying, and the water was the best thing she had ever tasted. Ellen sat across from her, waiting patiently until Grace had taken the edge off her hunger. Then she said, "Now, tell me." Grace told her everything. The words came tumbling out in a rush. Her father's gambling debts, Bernard Whitmore's offer, the arrangement made without her consent, the way Whitmore looked at her like she was property he had already purchased. She told Ellen about climbing out the window before dawn, about running into the hills, about Ethan finding her and offering help when he had no reason to do so. When she finished, Ellen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father is a fool, and Bernard Whitmore is a predator in a suit. You did the right thing running." "He will come looking for me," Grace said. "Whitmore, he will not let this go. He paid off my father's debts. In his mind, I belong to him now." "He can think whatever he wants," Ellen said sharply. "You are a human being, not a commodity. And on this ranch, we do not hand women over to men who treat them like property." She stood up. "You can stay here as long as you need. We have a spare room in the house, and if you're willing to work, we can always use extra hands with the accounts and supply management. Ethan mentioned you have experience running a business." "I do," Grace said, hope flickering in her chest. "I kept all the books for the saloon, managed inventory, handled orders." "Perfect," Ellen said. "We will work out the details later. For now, you need rest. Let me show you to your room." The room Ellen led her to was small but clean, with a real bed, and a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corrals. Grace set her satchel down on the bed and felt something inside her crack open. She had been so focused on surviving the last few hours that she had not allowed herself to think about what came next, but standing here in this safe space, that reality crashed over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ellen put a hand on her shoulder. "You are safe here. Rest now." Grace lay down on the bed, not even bothering to remove her boots, and fell into an exhausted sleep. She woke to the sound of voices outside her window. The sun had moved, casting longer shadows, and Grace judged it was late afternoon. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, before memory came flooding back. She was at Riverside Ranch. She was safe. She had escaped. The voices grew louder, and Grace recognized Ethan's deep tones mixed with another man's voice, older and rougher. She went to the window and peered out carefully. Ethan was standing near the main house, talking to a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. Her blood froze. Even from this distance, even from this angle, she recognized Bernard Whitmore. Grace backed away from the window, her heart hammering. He had found her. Somehow, impossibly, he had tracked her here. She pressed her back against the wall and tried to think. Maybe she could slip out, get to a horse, run again. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was futile. She could not run forever. She forced herself to move to the door, opened it a crack, and listened. "I am telling you, she is not here," Ethan was saying, his voice hard. "I do not know what makes you think she would be. You were seen riding north out of Placitas this morning, with a woman behind you," Whitmore said, and his voice was oily, confident. "My men tracked you straight here. Now, you can hand over my bride and there will be no trouble. Or you can keep lying and I will bring the sheriff into this. That girl is legally bound to marry me. Her father signed a contract." "A contract to marry is not the same as ownership," Ethan shot back. "And even if it were, I just told you she is not here." "Then you will not mind if I look around," Whitmore said. And Grace heard the threat underneath the polite words. "Actually, I do mind," another voice cut in, and Grace recognized Ellen's sharp tones. "This is private property, Mr. Whitmore, and you have no authority to search it. If you want to bring the sheriff, go ahead, but until you have legal grounds, you can get off my land." "Mrs. Cordero, I understand you think you are protecting the girl," Whitmore said, his voice hardening. "But you are interfering in a legal arrangement. Grace Jennings was promised to me. I paid off her father's considerable debts. She belongs to me." "No one belongs to you," Ellen said coldly. "And if I were you, I would be careful throwing around words like that. New Mexico territory may not be the most progressive place, but we still frown on slavery." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Grace knew she had to do something. She could not let Ethan and Ellen fight her battles, could not let them risk trouble with the law on her behalf. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her skirts, and walked out of the house. All eyes turned to her as she emerged. Whitmore's face lit up with triumph. Ethan looked torn between frustration and admiration. Ellen's expression was carefully neutral. "Grace," Whitmore said, and his voice dripped with false warmth. "Thank God. I have been so worried. Your father is beside himself. Come now, we will go back to Placitas and sort this all out. The wedding can still happen today, just a bit delayed." "No," Grace said, and her voice was steady. "I am not going back. I am not marrying you." Whitmore's smile faded. "Now, Grace, I understand you have cold feet. Many brides do. But you cannot just run away from your responsibilities. Your father and I have an agreement." "An agreement you made without my consent," Grace said. "I never agreed to marry you, Mr. Whitmore. My father made that decision, and I have unmade it." "You are being childish," Whitmore said, and now his voice had an edge of anger. "You do not have a choice in this. Your father has legal authority over you, and he gave that authority to me through our arrangement. Then take it up with a judge," Ellen said sharply. "But this conversation is over. You need to leave." Whitmore's face flushed dark red. He looked at Grace, and something ugly flickered in his eyes. "You think you can just run away and hide on some ranch? I own half this territory. I have connections, power, influence. You are nothing without me, a saloon keeper's daughter with no prospects and no future. I was offering you a life of comfort and respect, and you throw it in my face?" "I would rather have nothing than have you," Grace said, and the words felt like liberation. For a moment, she thought Whitmore might actually lunge at her. His hands clenched into fists, and his breathing grew harsh. But then, he seemed to remember where he was, surrounded by ranch hands who had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, and he forced himself to relax. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I will see you dragged back to Placitas if I have to. You made a promise, or at least your father did on your behalf, and I will see it kept." He turned and stalked toward his horse, a fine black gelding that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. He mounted with stiff, angry movements and rode off without another word, dust rising in his wake. Grace felt her knees start to give out, and suddenly Ethan was there, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. "Easy," he said quietly. "You did good." "He is going to come back," Grace said, her voice shaking. "He is not going to let this go." "Probably not," Ellen agreed, walking over to join them. "But that is a problem for tomorrow. Today you stood up to him. That is what matters." Grace wanted to believe her, but fear had settled like a stone in her stomach. Whitmore was powerful and vindictive, a dangerous combination. She had humiliated him, refused him in front of witnesses. Men like that did not forget such things. "Come on," Ethan said gently. "Let's get you back inside." That night, Grace lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, too wired to sleep despite her exhaustion. She could hear the normal sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Horses nickering in the corrals, someone playing a harmonica in one of the bunkhouses, the wind rustling through the cottonwoods. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, but they could not quiet the turmoil in her mind. A soft knock on her door made her sit up. "Yes?" "It is Ethan," came the reply. "Can I come in?" Grace hesitated, then said, "Yes." He opened the door, but stayed in the doorway, respecting the propriety of the situation. In the lamplight, she could see the concern on his face. "Could not sleep either?" he asked. "No," Grace admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Whitmore's face, the way he looked at me like I was something he had purchased." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My sister's name was Sarah. She was beautiful and kind, and she loved to sing. After she married that bastard, the singing stopped. The light went out of her eyes. By the time she died, she was a ghost of who she had been. He looked directly at Grace. "You are not going to end up like Sarah. I will not let that happen." "You cannot promise that," Grace said softly. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Ethan said. "I know you had the courage to climb out a window before dawn and run into the desert with nothing but hope and determination. I know you stood up to Whitmore today, even though you were terrified. I know you were stronger than you think you are." He paused. "And I know that I am not going to let him take you back." Something in his voice, some fierce protectiveness, made Grace's chest tighten. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "I think you know why," he said quietly. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. Grace should have looked away, should have said something to break the tension, but she found she could not. She had known this man for less than a day, but he had shown her more kindness, more respect, more genuine care than anyone else in her life ever had. "Get some rest," Ethan said finally, his voice rough. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Whitmore will probably go to the sheriff, try to make this official. We will need to be ready." He closed the door gently, and Grace lay back down, her mind spinning. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart racing. This was dangerous, these feelings taking root so quickly. She had just escaped one man. She could not afford to become entangled with another, no matter how different Ethan seemed. She needed to focus on survival, on building a new life, not on the way Ethan's eyes made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. But even as she told herself all of this, she knew it was already too late. The next morning, Ellen put Grace to work with the ranch accounts. The previous bookkeeper had left everything in a state of mild chaos, and Grace threw herself into organizing it with relief. It felt good to have something concrete to focus on, something she was good at. She worked at a desk in Ellen's office, surrounded by ledgers and invoices and supply lists, and for a few hours she almost forgot about Whitmore and the threat hanging over her head. Ethan found her there in the late afternoon, bent over a ledger, her hair escaping from its braid in wisps around her face. "Ellen sent me to tell you to take a break," he said from the doorway. "She says you have been at it for 6 hours straight." Grace looked up, blinking. "Has it been that long?" "According to Ellen, yes," Ethan said with a smile. "Come on, I want to show you something." She followed him outside and toward the corrals. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Ethan led her to a smaller corral where a young mare was pacing nervously. "This is Juniper," Ethan said. "She is a rescue. Previous owner beat her until she would not let anyone near her. We have been working with her for months, trying to rebuild her trust." He climbed over the fence into the corral, moving slowly and deliberately. Juniper's ears went back, and she pranced to the far side of the enclosure. Grace watched as Ethan stood still in the center of the corral, not approaching the horse, just being present. He started talking in a low, soothing voice. Not words exactly, just sounds. Gradually, Juniper's ears came forward, her pacing slowed. After several minutes, she took a tentative step toward Ethan. "That is it," Ethan murmured. "Nobody is going to hurt you. You are safe here." Juniper took another step, then another. Finally, she stretched her neck out and blew softly at Ethan's outstretched hand. He did not try to touch her, just let her investigate him on her own terms. After a moment, Juniper relaxed, her head dropping slightly. Ethan turned and caught Grace's eye. "Some creatures just need time and patience," he said. "They need to learn that not all hands are cruel, not all voices are harsh. But once they learn that, once they trust again, they are the most loyal companions you could ask for." Grace understood what he was really saying. She felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back. "She is lucky to have you." "I think it is the other way around," Ethan said. He gave Juniper one more quiet moment, then climbed back out of the corral. "Watching her heal reminds me why I do this work, why some battles are worth fighting." They stood side by side, watching Juniper graze peacefully, and Grace felt something inside her shift. She had spent so much of her life believing she had no choices, no power, no value beyond what others assigned her. But here, now, she was beginning to see herself differently. She was not a commodity or a bargaining chip. She was Grace, and she had agency, and she was worth fighting for. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." Ethan looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her skin warm. "You do not need to thank me. Just keep being the brave woman who climbed out that window." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, and Grace felt herself lean slightly toward him. Ethan's hand came up, his fingers brushing a strand of hair away from her face, in a gesture so tender it made her ache. She thought he might kiss her, hoped he might, but instead he stepped back, putting distance between them. "I should get back to work," he said, his voice rough. "Ellen wants me to check the fences in the north pasture before dark." He walked away, and Grace watched him go, her heart pounding. This was madness. She had known him for 2 days, but her heart did not seem to care about timelines or logic. Her heart had made its own decision, reckless and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Grace worked on the ranch accounts in the mornings and helped Ellen with supply management in the afternoons. The work was satisfying in a way that serving drinks at her father's saloon had never been. Ellen praised her organizational skills and her attention to detail, making Grace feel competent and valuable. In the evenings, she often found herself gravitating to wherever Ethan was working, watching him gentle horses or repair tack, or simply exist in that easy, confident way he had. They talked during those evenings, long conversations about everything and nothing. Grace learned that Ethan had been born in Texas, that his father had been a harsh man who believed love made you weak, that his mother had died when he was young. She learned that he had always felt more at home with animals than people, that he believed in fairness and hard work and keeping your word. She learned that his favorite time of day was early morning when the world was quiet and full of possibility. Ethan learned that Grace's mother had been a school teacher before she married, that she had taught Grace to read and write and love books. He learned that Grace had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, before her mother's death and her father's decline had made such dreams impossible. He learned that she missed her mother every single day, that she felt guilty for running away even though she knew it was the right choice, that she was terrified of being found and dragged back to Placitas. "You will not be," Ethan told her one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set. "I will not let that happen." "You keep saying that," Grace said, "but you cannot control everything. Whitmore has resources, connections. If he wants to make trouble, he can." "Let him try," Ethan said, and there was steel in his voice. "He will find out that some people do not respond well to threats." Grace looked at him, at the stubborn set of his jaw and the protective fire in his eyes, and felt her heart turn over in her chest. She had never had anyone fight for her before. The realization was overwhelming. "Ethan," she said softly, and he turned to her. The expression on his face took her breath away. He looked at her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was worth protecting, not because she belonged to him, but because she existed, and that was reason enough. "Grace," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers threading through hers. The touch was electric, sending sparks up her arm. She should pull away, should maintain some distance, but she found herself holding on tighter instead. "I know this is fast," Ethan said, his voice low. "I know you just escaped one man, and the last thing you probably want is another man making claims on your time or your attention. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, it is real. It is not pity or obligation or some misplaced hero complex. It is you, the way you fight, the way you think, the way you refuse to be diminished. You are extraordinary, Grace. And I—" He trailed off, and Grace squeezed his hand. "You what?" "I am falling in love with you," Ethan said simply. "I think I started the moment I saw you behind that boulder, scared and brave all at once." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to trust this." "Then we will figure it out together," Ethan said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that it made Grace's chest ache. No pressure, no expectations, just honesty and time. "We have time, Grace. No one is taking that away from us." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to sink into the certainty in his voice and let it carry her. But the fear was still there, a constant presence in the back of her mind. Whitmore was still out there. Her father was still out there. The life she had run from was still waiting to pull her back. As if summoned by her thoughts, a rider appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Grace recognized him immediately. Deputy Tom Carson, a man who frequented her father's saloon and who had always looked at her with uncomfortable intensity. She stood up abruptly, pulling her hand from Ethan's. "Grace," Ethan said, standing as well, his eyes on the approaching rider. "That is Deputy Carson," Grace said, her voice tight. "He must be here about me." Ellen came out of the house, drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. She took one look at Grace's face and the approaching deputy, and her expression hardened. "Stay calm," she said. "Let me handle this." Deputy Carson pulled up in front of the porch and dismounted. He was a stocky man in his 30s with a thick mustache and small, calculating eyes. He touched his hat to Ellen, but his gaze went straight to Grace. "Miss Jennings," he said, "I am here on official business. Mr. Bernard Whitmore has filed a complaint with the sheriff. He says you ran away from a legal marital arrangement and are currently trespassing on this property." "She is not trespassing," Ellen said sharply. "She is a guest on my ranch, and she is welcome here as long as she wants to stay." "That may be, Mrs. Cordero, but Mr. Whitmore has legal standing," Carson said. "He paid off Thomas Jennings' debts with the understanding that his daughter would marry him. That is a binding contract." "A contract I never signed," Grace said, finding her voice. "My father may have agreed to it, but I did not. You cannot force someone to marry against their will, Deputy. Actually, in the eyes of the law, your father has authority over you until you marry or turn 21, Carson said, "and he has ordered you to return home and fulfill your obligation to Mr. Whitmore." "I am not going back," Grace said. "Then I will have to arrest you for breach of contract and return you to Placitas," Carson said, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. Ethan stepped in front of Grace so fast that Carson actually took a step back. "You are not arresting anyone," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Grace is an adult woman making a choice about her own life. If Whitmore has a problem with that, he can take it to a judge, but you are not taking her anywhere." "You are interfering with the law," Carson warned. "I am protecting someone from being forced into a situation against her will," Ethan countered. "There is a difference." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Grace could see other ranch hands drifting closer, drawn by the confrontation. Carson seemed to realize he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, at least for the moment. "Fine," he said tersely, "but this is not over. Mr. Whitmore will take this to Judge Harrington, and when he does, you will be ordered to return to Placitas. If you do not comply with a judge's order, it will be kidnapping, and then I really will arrest everyone involved." He looked directly at Ethan. "Is she worth that much trouble?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "She is." Carson shook his head in disgust, mounted his horse, and rode off. Grace felt her knees start to buckle, and Ethan caught her, his arms coming around her in a protective embrace. She pressed her face against his chest and tried to breathe. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. "If Whitmore gets a judge to order me back, I will not have a choice." "We will figure something out," Ellen said, but even she sounded less certain than usual. That night, Grace, Ethan, and Ellen sat around the kitchen table, trying to come up with a plan. Sam Cordero, Ellen's husband, had returned from a cattle drive to the north and joined them. He was a quiet man in his 50s with weathered features and kind eyes, and he listened carefully as Ellen explained the situation. "The problem is the law is on Whitmore's side, at least technically," Sam said when she finished. "Fathers do have authority over their daughters until marriage or legal age. If a judge rules that Grace must return, we will not have much recourse." "Unless she is no longer under her father's authority," Ethan said slowly. An idea was forming in his mind, something radical and desperate, but possibly the only solution. He looked at Grace. "You said you do not turn 21 for another year?" 8 months, Grace confirmed. "My birthday is in November." "But if you were married, your father's authority would transfer to your husband," Ethan said. "And if your husband refused to hand you over to Whitmore, there would be nothing Whitmore could do about it." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Ellen said, "Ethan, are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" "I am suggesting that Grace and I get married," Ethan said, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Not because anyone is forcing us or because of debts or obligations, but because it would protect her from Whitmore, and because—" he took a breath, "because I want to. Because I love her, and I know it is fast and crazy and probably the worst proposal anyone has ever heard, but I cannot think of any other way to keep her safe." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. Married to Ethan. A week ago, she had been preparing to marry Bernard Whitmore in a ceremony that would have destroyed her. Now, she was being offered marriage to a man who looked at her like she was the sunrise, who had shown her more respect and care in a handful of days than anyone else had in years. "Grace," Ethan said gently, "I am not asking you to love me back, at least not right away. I know trust takes time, but I am asking you to let me protect you the only way I know how. We can make it a real marriage or a marriage in name only, whatever you are comfortable with. No pressure, no expectations beyond mutual respect and honesty. Just a chance to build something better than what either of us has had before." "You would do that for me," Grace whispered. "Marry me to keep me safe." "I would do that with you," Ethan corrected. "Not for you, with you, because I think we could be good together. Because when I look at you, I see a future I actually want." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. This was insane. She had known him for less than a week, but she also knew that what she felt for him was real, deeper and truer than anything she had experienced before. She knew that he was kind and brave and fiercely protective. She knew that he saw her as a person, not property. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she trusted him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Ethan's face lit up with a smile that transformed him, and he reached across the table to take her hands. "You are sure?" "I am terrified," Grace admitted. "But yes, I am sure." "Well," Sam said, breaking the emotional moment with practical reality, "we will need to move fast. If Whitmore is going to Judge Harrington, he will probably get a ruling within a few days. We need to have this marriage legal and documented before that happens." "The preacher in Bernalillo owes me a favor," Ellen said. "I will ride over there tomorrow and arrange it. We can have the ceremony the day after, keep it simple and quick." "I will go with you," Grace said. "I want to be part of planning this, even if it is not a traditional wedding." "It will be better than traditional," Ethan said softly, his eyes on Grace. "It will be ours." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Ellen and Grace rode to Bernalillo, a small town about 15 miles east of the ranch, and spoke with Reverend Matthews, a thin, serious man who asked no questions and agreed to perform the ceremony. Grace used some of her saved money to buy a simple dress in a pale cream color, not white because this was not that kind of wedding, but something that made her feel special nonetheless. Ethan disappeared for several hours and returned with a plain gold band that he had bought from a jeweler in a different town. It was not fancy, but it was solid and real, and when he showed it to Grace, she felt her heart squeeze. "It is perfect," she said. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in the small church in Bernalillo. Ellen and Sam served as witnesses, along with Reverend Matthews' wife. Grace wore her new dress and had woven wildflowers into her hair. Ethan wore his best shirt and trousers and had shaved carefully, though he had missed a small spot under his jaw that Grace found endearing. They stood in front of the altar, and Reverend Matthews began the ceremony. Grace heard the words as if from a distance, too focused on Ethan's face, on the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. When it came time for the vows, Ethan's voice was steady and clear. "I, Ethan Mallory, take you, Grace Jennings, to be my wife. I promise to respect you, protect you, and stand beside you in whatever comes. I promise to value your voice and honor your choices. I promise to build a life with you that is based on honesty and partnership. This I swear." Grace's voice shook, but she meant every word. "I, Grace Jennings, take you, Ethan Mallory, to be my husband. I promise to trust you with my fears and my hopes. I promise to stand beside you and support you. I promise to build a life with you that is worthy of the courage it took to get here. This I swear." Ethan slipped the gold band onto her finger, and Grace felt the weight of it like an anchor, grounding her. Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, carefully, like she was something precious. Grace kissed him back and felt the last of her fear dissolve into something brighter and more powerful. They were married. She was Grace Mallory now, not Grace Jennings, and that changed everything. They returned to Riverside Ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Ellen had prepared a small celebration dinner, and they ate together in the warm kitchen, laughing and talking as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Grace kept looking down at the ring on her finger, marveling at its existence. After dinner, Ethan and Grace walked out to the corrals under a sky full of stars. The night was cool and quiet, and Grace felt a peace settle over her that she had not known was possible. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked softly. "I am married," Grace said, and then she laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "I ran away from one wedding and ended up in another, and somehow this one feels like the most right thing I have ever done." "No regrets?" Ethan asked, and she heard the vulnerability beneath the question. "None," Grace said firmly. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Ethan, I know this started as a practical solution, but I need you to know that for me, it is already more than that. What I feel for you is real. It is love, or at least the beginning of it, and it is growing every day." Ethan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you, Grace. I have loved you since you stepped out from behind that boulder, brave and terrified and refusing to give up. This marriage may have started as protection, but it is going to be so much more. I promise you that." They stood there under the stars, holding each other, and Grace felt the future open up before her like a road she actually wanted to travel. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Deputy Carson showed up 3 days later with a court summons. Judge Harrington had ruled in Whitmore's favor and ordered Grace to return to Placitas to fulfill her marital obligation. Carson's face was smug as he handed the paper to Ellen. "You have 24 hours to produce Grace Jennings, or there will be consequences," he said. "Grace Jennings does not exist anymore," Ellen said calmly. "She is Grace Mallory now." Carson blinked. "What?" "She got married 4 days ago," Ellen said. "To Ethan Mallory. That means her father's authority over her has been legally transferred to her husband, which means Whitmore's claim is void." Carson's face went from smug to furious. "You cannot be serious." "We are completely serious," Ethan said, walking out of the barn with Grace beside him. "Grace is my wife. We have the legal paperwork to prove it, and I am not handing her over to anyone." "This is a trick," Carson sputtered. "Whitmore will not accept this." "Whitmore does not have a choice," Grace said, and she felt powerful saying it. "I am married to someone else. Whatever arrangement he had with my father is meaningless now." Carson looked like he wanted to argue, but the legal reality was clear. A married woman was under her husband's authority, not her father's. There was no grounds for forcing Grace to return to Placitas or marry Whitmore. "He is not going to let this go," Carson warned. "He is going to be furious." "Let him be furious," Ethan said. "We did nothing illegal. We just outsmarted him." Carson left, and Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Is it really over?" "The legal part is," Sam said. But Carson was right about one thing. Whitmore is not going to be happy. You should be prepared for him to try something else. "Let him try," Grace said, and she meant it. She was not the terrified girl who had climbed out a window anymore. She was a married woman with people who loved her, and a future she had chosen for herself. Whitmore no longer had power over her, and that realization was intoxicating. Whitmore did try, of course. Over the next few weeks, he spread rumors around Placitas and the surrounding towns, claiming that Grace had been coerced into marrying Ethan, that the marriage was a sham designed to cheat him out of what he was owed. But rumors were just words, and they had no legal weight. Grace and Ethan ignored them and focused on building their life together. They settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Grace continued working on the ranch accounts and supply management, proving herself invaluable to Ellen and Sam. Ethan worked the cattle and horses, and in the evenings, he taught Grace to ride. She was a tentative student at first, nervous about the size and power of the animals, but under Ethan's patient instruction, she began to relax and even enjoy it. "You are a natural," Ethan told her one evening, as she successfully guided her horse through a series of turns in the corral. "I have a good teacher," Grace said, smiling at him. Their marriage remained chaste in those first few weeks. Ethan never pushed, never demanded anything she was not ready to give. They slept in the same room, but with a respectful distance between them, and Grace appreciated his patience more than she could say. She was learning to trust him not just with her safety, but with her heart, and that took time. One night, about a month after the wedding, Grace woke from a nightmare, gasping and disoriented. She had dreamed that Whitmore had found her, that he had dragged her back to Placitas and locked her in a room where she could not escape. The terror of it clung to her even as she realized it was just a dream. "Grace," Ethan's voice came from across the room, rough with sleep. "Are you all right?" "Just a nightmare," Grace said, trying to steady her breathing. She heard him move, and then he was kneeling beside her bed, his face visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. "What can I do?" "Just stay," Grace whispered. "Please." Ethan climbed into the bed beside her, careful to maintain some space, and Grace found herself closing that distance, pressing against his warmth. He wrapped his arms around her, and she buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and something uniquely Ethan. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair. "You are safe, I promise." Grace tilted her head back to look at him, and the expression on his face made her heart race. "Ethan," she whispered. He understood what she was asking without her having to say it. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and deep and full of all the feelings they had been carefully banking for weeks. Grace kissed him back with everything in her, pouring her love and trust and gratitude into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am sure," Grace said. "I love you, Ethan. I want this to be a real marriage in every sense." What followed was tender and careful and perfect in its imperfection. Ethan was patient and attentive, making sure she felt safe and valued every moment. Grace gave herself to him fully, and in return, he gave her everything he was. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Grace felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. "I love you," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Grace whispered, and she fell asleep in his arms, finally, truly safe. The seasons changed, summer giving way to fall. Grace's 21st birthday came and went, celebrated with a small party at the ranch. The fact that she was now legally an adult, no longer under anyone's authority but her own, felt like a final severing of the chains that had once bound her. She was free in every sense that mattered. Her father showed up at the ranch one afternoon in late November, looking older and more haggard than Grace remembered. She met him at the gate, refusing to let him come any closer. "Grace," Thomas Jennings said, and his voice was pleading, "I need to talk to you." "You have nothing to say that I want to hear," Grace said coldly. "I made a mistake," her father said. "I was desperate, drowning in debt, and Whitmore offered a way out. I should not have tried to force you into it. I am sorry." "You are sorry now because it did not work," Grace said, "not because you realize what you tried to do was wrong." "That is not true," Thomas protested, but they both knew it was a lie. "I am not coming back," Grace said. "I am not going to run the saloon or take care of you or clean up your messes anymore. I have a life here, a real life with people who value me. You lost the right to be part of that when you tried to sell me to Bernard Whitmore." "He has made my life hell," Thomas said, and now there was anger in his voice. "He spread rumors, turned people against me, ruined my business. The saloon is barely making enough to keep the doors open." "That is not my problem," Grace said, and she meant it. "You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." She turned and walked back toward the ranch house, leaving her father standing at the gate. She expected to feel guilt or sadness, but all she felt was relief. That chapter of her life was closed, and she had no desire to reopen it. Ethan was waiting for her on the porch. He did not ask what her father had wanted. He just pulled her into his arms and held her. Grace sank into his embrace and let the last vestiges of her old life drift away like smoke. Grace discovered she was pregnant in early January of 1879. The realization came gradually. The exhaustion, the waves of nausea, the way her body felt different. Ellen confirmed her suspicions with a knowing look and a hug. "Congratulations," Ellen said warmly. "How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified," Grace admitted, and excited, and completely overwhelmed. "That sounds about right," Ellen said with a laugh. "Being a mother is all of those things at once, but you are strong, Grace. You will be wonderful at it." Telling Ethan was the hardest part. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, when Grace finally worked up the courage. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice shaking. Ethan turned to her, concern immediate on his face. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Grace said quickly. "At least, I hope nothing is wrong. I am pregnant, Ethan. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her. Then his face broke into the most beautiful smile Grace had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her breathless. "We are going to have a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Grace, that is incredible. How are you feeling? Are you all right? Do you need anything?" His immediate concern and joy made Grace laugh through her tears. "I am all right, tired and a bit nauseous, but all right." "I am going to be a father," Ethan said, and he looked almost dazed. "I am going to be a father, and I am going to do it right, nothing like my father. This child is going to know love and safety and that they are wanted." "They will," Grace promised, "because they have you as a father." The pregnancy was difficult at times, the nausea lasting well into her 4th month. But Grace had never been happier. She continued working on the ranch accounts as long as she could, finally stepping back in her 7th month when the exhaustion became too much. Ethan was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly checking on her, making sure she was comfortable, worrying about every little thing. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Grace told him one afternoon when he tried to prevent her from walking to the barn. "I know," Ethan said, looking sheepish. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe." "We are safe," Grace assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her swollen belly. "Feel that? The baby is strong. We are both strong." Ethan's eyes filled with wonder as he felt the baby kick beneath his palm. "That is our child," he said softly. "Half you, half me. A miracle?" Grace went into labor on a hot August afternoon. Ellen and a midwife named Mrs. Patterson attended her, while Ethan paced outside, too nervous to sit still. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night, but finally, as dawn broke over the ranch, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Ethan was finally allowed into the room, he approached the bed slowly, his eyes wide with awe. Grace held up their son, wrapped in a soft blanket, and Ethan reached out with trembling hands to take him. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered, staring down at the tiny face. "Grace, he is perfect." "He has your eyes," Grace said, exhausted but elated. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, going back and forth between options. But looking at his son, Ethan knew exactly what felt right. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Thomas Mallory, after Sam Cordero, for giving us a chance and a home. And Thomas, so he has a connection to your family, even if it is complicated." Grace felt tears slide down her cheeks. "Samuel, it is perfect." Their son grew quickly, a happy baby, with Ethan's blue-green eyes and Grace's smile. Watching Ethan with Samuel was one of Grace's greatest joys. He was patient and gentle, singing silly songs and making funny faces, completely devoted to his son in a way that made Grace fall even more in love with him. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic, but deeply fulfilling. Grace returned to managing the ranch accounts part-time, working while Samuel napped. Ellen doted on the baby, calling him her honorary grandson, and Sam taught him to recognize different animals before he could even walk. When Samuel was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1882. They named her Catherine Ellen Mallory, after Grace's mother and Ellen Cordero. Catherine had Grace's dark blonde hair and Ethan's stubborn determination, apparent even in infancy. Bernard Whitmore died in 1883, thrown from his horse during a drunken ride. Grace heard the news from a traveler passing through and felt nothing. The man who had once loomed so large in her nightmares was gone, and he had no power over her, not even in memory. Her father passed away a year later, his liver finally giving out after years of drinking. Grace attended the funeral, but felt no grief, only a vague sadness for the man he could have been, but never was. She inherited the saloon and immediately sold it, using the money to buy additional land for the ranch and to start a small fund for Samuel and Catherine's futures. The years passed, marked by the growth of their children and the deepening of their love. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the horses like his father. Catherine was wild and joyful, always getting into mischief and making everyone laugh. Grace and Ethan added 2 more children to their family, a son named Benjamin in 1885 and a daughter named Margaret in 1888. Their adobe house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with new rooms added as needed. The walls echoed with laughter and arguments and all the noise of a full, vibrant life. Grace sometimes thought back to that terrified girl climbing out a window before dawn and marveled at how far she had come. One evening in the summer of 1890, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Samuel, now 12, was teaching 10-year-old Catherine to rope a practice steer. Benjamin, 5, was chasing chickens, and 2-year-old Margaret was toddling around under Ellen's watchful eye. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked suddenly. "Marrying me so quickly? Taking on all this responsibility?" Ethan turned to her, genuine confusion on his face. "Regret it? Grace, you gave me a life I did not even know I wanted. A family, a home, a purpose beyond just getting through the day. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Even with 4 children running around driving us crazy?" Grace teased. "Especially with 4 children running around," Ethan said, pulling her close. "Every single moment, even the hard ones, has been worth it. You made the bravest choice that morning when you climbed out that window, but I made the best choice when I decided to help you, and then the even better choice when I asked you to marry me." Grace kissed him, slow and sweet, the kiss of 2 people who had built something lasting and real. "I love you," she said, "more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Ethan said, "always." The children's laughter rang out across the yard, and Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, watching the sun paint the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and pink. She had fled her arranged marriage before dawn 12 years ago, terrified and alone. But she had found something she never expected: true love, genuine partnership, and a family built on respect and choice rather than obligation and control. The Wild West was still wild in many ways, still harsh and unforgiving. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the people she loved most, Grace felt nothing but peace. She had made the bravest choice, and it had led her to the most beautiful life she could have imagined. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Samuel grew into a talented horseman, eventually taking over much of the livestock management from his aging father. Catherine developed a head for numbers, like her mother, and became Grace's partner in managing the ranch finances. Benjamin turned out to have a gift with people, charming and diplomatic, often mediating disputes between neighboring ranches. Margaret inherited her mother's love of learning and her father's determination, and she eventually became a teacher in Bernalillo, fulfilling the dream Grace had once held for herself. Ethan's hair turned gray at the temples, and Grace's face gained lines around her eyes from years of squinting in the sun and smiling. But their love never wavered. If anything, it deepened, becoming the bedrock upon which their entire family was built. Ellen and Sam Cordero eventually retired and turned over full ownership of Riverside Ranch to Ethan and Grace in 1895. It was a gift and a responsibility that they accepted with gratitude and determination to honor the trust placed in them. They expanded the operation, adding more cattle and horses, building a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock that spread throughout New Mexico territory and beyond. In 1898, Grace received word that Bernard Whitmore's estate was finally being settled. His will included a bizarre codicil attempting to leave a portion of his wealth to "the woman who should have been my wife," presumably meaning Grace. She refused the inheritance without hesitation, instructing the lawyers to distribute her portion to various charities in the territory. She wanted nothing from him, not even his money. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, Grace and Ethan celebrated with their children and grandchildren. Samuel had married a rancher's daughter named Alice, and they had given Grace and Ethan 4 grandchildren. Catherine had married a banker named Robert, and they had 3 children. Benjamin had married his childhood sweetheart Mary, and they had 5 children. Margaret remained unmarried, devoted to her teaching, but she was the favorite aunt to all the grandchildren, filling their heads with stories and knowledge. Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house one evening in 1915, surrounded by her sprawling, chaotic, beautiful family. She was 67 years old, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled with arthritis. Ethan sat beside her, 72, and still strong despite his age, his hand clasped in hers like it had been for 37 years. "Tell us the story again, grandmother," one of the grandchildren begged, "about how you and grandfather met." Grace smiled, exchanging a glance with Ethan. They had told this story countless times, but it never got old. "Well," Grace began, her voice still strong, It all started before dawn, on a March morning in 1878. I was 20 years old, and I did something that terrified me, but saved my life. I climbed out my bedroom window and ran. The children leaned in, captivated even though they had heard it before. Grace continued, telling them about the rocky hills, the sound of hooves, the cowboy who had appeared at exactly the right moment. She told them about Ethan's kindness, his protection, the way he had looked at her and said those words that had changed everything. "You made the bravest choice," Ethan had told her all those years ago, and he had been right. It had been brave. It had also been the beginning of everything that mattered. As Grace finished the story, she looked around at the faces of her family, her children, now adults with silver in their own hair, her grandchildren, wide-eyed and dreaming of their own adventures, her husband, still looking at her with the same love and admiration he had shown that first morning. This was her legacy. Not just the ranch or the land or the business they had built, but this family, these relationships, this proof that courage and love could create something lasting and beautiful, even in the harshest of landscapes. "The moral of the story," Grace told the children, "is that you always have a choice, even when it feels like you do not. It might be a hard choice, a scary choice, a choice that changes everything, but you have the power to choose your own path, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself." The children nodded solemnly, and Grace knew that at least some of them understood. They would carry this story forward, tell it to their own children and grandchildren, and maybe somewhere down the line, someone would hear it and find the courage to make their own brave choice. As the evening deepened into night and the family began to drift toward their respective homes, Grace and Ethan remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Grace replied, as she always did. And it was true. From that terrifying morning, when she had fled her arranged marriage, to this peaceful evening, surrounded by love and family, every moment had been exactly what it needed to be. She had made the bravest choice, and it had given her the most extraordinary life. The end.